They cuffed a black woman in silence and didn't realize they just handcuffed Congress. The morning was quiet, crisp, and ordinary. Sunlight filtered through the windows of a high-end grocery store nestled in the affluent heart of West Haven. Everything was polished, floors gleamed, shelves stood in perfect rows. Customers browsed slowly, as if their time mattered more than anyone else's. When Leona Hayes stepped through the glass doors, no alarms sounded, no one shouted. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet everything changed. She wore a navy blue sweatshirt, jeans, and walking shoes. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy. Her locks were pulled back into a low, neat ponytail. Her face calm, unreadable. She pushed a small cart past the entryway, scanning the signs above each aisle. All she wanted was fruit. Apples, bananas, maybe some blueberries. Her fridge was nearly empty after 2 weeks of back-to-back committee hearings and policy meetings. For the first time in days, she had space to breathe. No aides, no cameras, no press. No badge. That was intentional. Today, she wasn't Congresswoman Leona Hayes. Today, she was just a woman shopping for breakfast. But the store did not see her that way. As she turned the corner into produce, a man in a blazer standing near the pineapples gave her a second glance. Then a third. He said nothing, but his eyes lingered just a moment too long. 2 aisles down, a mother subtly nudged her child to stand closer, shifting her purse to the opposite shoulder. No one shouted, no one called her names, but the space around her began to constrict. She felt it in the way people moved, the way glances traveled up and down her frame before darting away. She didn't look lost. She didn't look angry. She didn't look suspicious. She simply didn't look like she belonged. It was a feeling she had known all her life, one that she had buried beneath degrees, speeches, and votes. But in that pristine store, beneath designer lights and imported citrus, it returned with full clarity. Still, she said nothing. She picked out 2 Granny Smith apples and placed them gently in her cart. At the end of the aisle stood a man in a security vest. He wasn't watching the cameras. He wasn't adjusting inventory. He was watching her. Eyes fixed, mouth pressed into a line. Leona didn't acknowledge him. She didn't have to. She had seen this before, too many times to count. The silent alert passed between strangers. The weight of suspicion carried not by actions, but by appearance. She chose her fruit. She kept her hands visible, her pace calm. Her cart half full. Still, she felt it. Eyes that trailed her. Voices that lowered behind her. And somewhere, behind a manager's desk, a quiet call being made without cause. Because for all her titles, all her votes cast on the House floor, in that moment, Leona Hayes was not a woman of position. She was a presence that made people uncomfortable, and no one, not one person in that store, saw what was really happening. They didn't see strength. They didn't see restraint. They didn't see the woman who had authored a landmark bill on police accountability. They saw a black woman alone. And they assumed something was off. It started the way these things often do, not with shouting, not with confrontation, just a look, the kind of look that says, "What are you doing here?" without speaking a word. Leona was standing near the bananas, reading the price tag. She liked to check labels, habits formed from years of budgeting and not wasting food. While her hands were still, her instincts stirred. She could feel someone watching her again. She turned slightly, casually, the way anyone might in a grocery store. And there he was, a man in his early 50s, wearing a crisp security vest, leaning just enough against the end of the aisle to make his presence known without saying a word. His name tag read, Mr. Fletcher, but his posture didn't invite introduction. He wasn't adjusting displays. He wasn't scanning for shoplifters in general. He was watching her, and only her. Leona held his stare for a breath, then turned away, picking out a bunch of bananas and placing them gently in her cart. She didn't rush. She didn't flinch. She had lived through worse. But the pressure in the air began to shift. An employee in a red apron approached her from the side. She smiled tightly, too tightly, and said, "Do you need help finding something, ma'am?" Leona turned, polite, but measured. "No, thank you." The employee hesitated for a second too long, then nodded and stepped away. Not toward another customer, but back toward the guard. Leona exhaled slowly. It was happening. Again. She moved to the next section. Oranges. Her fingers brushed the skin of one as she lifted it, turning it gently in her palm. Behind her, she could hear faint radio static. Someone's walkie-talkie clicked, a quiet code exchanged. Not loud, not obvious, but deliberate. She placed the orange in the cart and looked up. Mr. Fletcher was still there. And now he was walking toward her, not with urgency, but with decision. "Ma'am," he said, "can I speak with you for a moment?" Leona didn't respond right away. She looked at him fully now. Calm, composed, the way she had practiced her whole life. "What seems to be the issue?" she asked. "I need to see your bag," he said. Leona blinked. "I haven't left the store." "I know," he said. "Just procedure." She looked down at her shoulder bag, then back at him. "There's no cause," she replied. Her voice was still even. "You haven't accused me of anything." "We received a report," he said quickly. "Something unusual." "From whom?" "Mr. Fletcher shifted. "That's not important." "It is to me." Their eyes locked. Other customers passed them, carts squeaking, eyes flicking toward the interaction, then away again. No one stopped. No one intervened. Because no one ever does when the person being questioned is a black woman in plain clothes. They assume there must be a reason, even when there isn't. "Mr. Fletcher gestured slightly toward the exit. "Would you mind stepping with me?" Leona didn't answer right away. She looked around. Not for help, but to remember who was watching. To remember the silence. To remember the space where people chose not to stand. Then she nodded once. "Fine," she said. And began walking. Because sometimes the only way to expose a system is to let it complete the performance. Let them feel in control. Right before they learn who they were actually dealing with. The walk toward the exit felt longer than it was. Leona didn't resist. She didn't look back. She didn't ask if she was being detained or why. She knew those questions never mattered in spaces where judgment had already been passed. Mr. Fletcher walked half a step behind her, close enough to control her direction, far enough to avoid appearing aggressive. His voice stayed low as he murmured into his radio. She didn't catch every word, just enough to know that someone else was waiting. As they neared the front of the store, 2 police officers stood just outside the glass doors. One of them rested a hand on his utility belt. The other had already unclipped something from his waist. Customers passed between them, holding reusable bags and takeout cups, too absorbed in their own errands to look closely. One woman did glance over. She made eye contact with Leona for half a second, then looked away. That was enough. Leona stepped outside. The officer with the notepad spoke first. "Ma'am, we've received a call about suspicious behavior. I'll need to see your ID." Leona kept her voice calm. "I haven't done anything wrong." "I didn't say you had," he replied. "Then why are you asking for ID outside of an investigation?" The officer exhaled through his nose. He didn't answer her question. "I'm going to have to ask you to put your hands behind your back." That sentence landed with quiet force. She knew what came next, not because she had ever committed a crime, but because she had seen this play out before, for others, for people who looked like her, for people who didn't get to explain. One by one, passers-by began to slow down. But no one stopped. No one pulled out their phone. No one said, "Why is this happening?" Because to them, it didn't look unusual. It looked like protocol. Leona turned slowly. Her hands moved behind her back with the grace of someone who had rehearsed this moment in nightmares. The officer fastened the cuffs. They were not gentle, but not aggressive either. Just efficient. Just cold. Her bag was taken. Her cart left behind. "Are you placing me under arrest?" she asked again. The officer didn't respond. Another glance toward his partner. A quiet nod, a hand on her arm. They began walking toward the squad car. Inside the store, the cashier returned to scanning produce. A man in line checked his phone. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "What happened?" His mother didn't answer. She just moved him to the other side. At the patrol car, Leona ducked her head slightly as she was guided into the back seat. The door closed behind her with a dull, final thud. No badge, no title, no microphone waiting for a statement. Just silence and the quiet press of steel against her wrists. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She simply stared out the window as the engine rumbled to life. And in that moment, surrounded by strangers who had already judged her, she made a choice. She would remember every face, every silence, every hand that reached for cuffs before compassion. Because when the truth came out, and it would, she wanted every person involved to remember this moment too. Not the volume of her voice, not the fight she didn't give, but the calm in her eyes, the stillness in her breath, the silence that would eventually speak louder than any headline. The holding room was grey and quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't peaceful, it was procedural. Empty, the silence of linoleum floors, fluorescent lights, and a system that had done this before. Leona sat alone on a hard bench. Her hands were no longer cuffed, but the pressure around her wrists remained, a slow, invisible ache. She hadn't said much since arriving. No protests, no pleas, no mention of her name or her title. The officers had filed her under uncooperative but calm. There was no urgency in how they handled her, just paperwork, just process. A young officer entered with a clipboard. "You're allowed one call," he said, not meeting her eyes. Leona didn't ask for a phone book. She didn't ask if it would be recorded. She gave him the number. He handed her the receiver, then stepped back. The line rang once, then twice. On the third ring, someone picked up. She didn't say hello. She didn't explain. She simply said his name. "Malcolm." A pause. Then the voice on the other end shifted. "Sis?" "I'm at the precinct on Ashbury," she said. No panic, no tremble. "What happened?" he asked. Leona didn't answer right away. "I walked into a grocery store," she said. "I bought fruit." Another pause. A long one. Then she added, "I need you to see this through." That was all. Malcolm didn't ask for details. He didn't ask if she was okay. He just said, "Give me 10 minutes." Then the line went dead. Leona set the receiver down gently. She didn't exhale. She didn't shift on the bench. She just looked straight ahead. And waited. Because she knew her brother. And she knew what 10 minutes meant when you were the United States Attorney General. 10 minutes after the call, the air inside the precinct shifted. No doors slammed open. No sirens pierced the silence. But something changed. At the front desk, the phone rang with an unfamiliar tone. The officer on duty answered, bored at first, until he heard the name on the other end. His shoulders pulled back. His hand reached for a notepad he suddenly didn't need. His voice dropped into a register somewhere between formality and fear. He stood up, walked briskly to the captain's office, didn't even knock. Inside, a quiet cluster formed around a glowing screen. An email had just arrived. The subject line was simple. Federal contact, immediate response required. The sender, Office of the United States Attorney General. The name at the bottom of the message made the room fall still. Malcolm Hayes. A name most officers had only heard in headlines. A man whose press conferences shaped policy, whose signature carried federal weight. He wasn't calling as a brother. He was calling as the highest law enforcement official in the country. Back in the holding room, Leona hadn't moved. She sat exactly where they left her. No complaint. No visible anger, just quiet. The door opened, but this time it wasn't a beat cop. It was a man in command, Captain Rawlins. His badge glinted under the fluorescent light. His expression was tight, cautious. The kind of look reserved for when someone realizes they've made a career-altering mistake. "Miss Hayes," he began. Leona looked up slowly. She didn't correct him. She didn't remind him of her title. She let him keep going. "There seems to have been an unfortunate miscommunication." "A miscommunication," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. We were unaware of who you were." "But you didn't ask," she replied. He shifted slightly, trying to steady himself. "Had we known—" "You would have treated me differently," she finished for him. He didn't respond. Because there was nothing he could say. The quiet in the room grew thicker. Outside the precinct, unmarked federal vehicles had already arrived. They didn't come with lights or sound, just presence. Their arrival wasn't about show. It was about message. Someone in that building had treated a sitting congresswoman like a criminal. Worse, they had done it not because of her actions, but because of her appearance. And now, the system was responding. Not through anger, through process. Through precision, through consequence. Captain Rawlins cleared his throat. "We're releasing you immediately. No charges filed. We regret what happened." Leona stood without a word. She picked up her bag, checked it once. Nothing missing. Nothing broken, except the illusion that these institutions always knew what they were doing. Captain Rawlins stepped aside as she walked out. He didn't try to shake her hand. She wouldn't have taken it. The moment Leona Hayes stepped out of the precinct, the building behind her was no longer just a police station. It was now a scene, not of violence, not of chaos, but of reckoning. Inside, The whispers had already started. A junior officer, checking shift logs, glanced up from his screen and blinked twice. Her name had just updated in the system, not as an arrestee, but as an elected official with federal clearance. His eyes scanned the room nervously. At the front desk, the phone kept ringing. Every call came from someone with a badge number higher than the last. District Command. State Oversight. Internal Affairs. It was no longer a question of what happened. It had become, how could you let it happen to her? In the parking lot, Leona moved with quiet purpose. She didn't rush. She didn't look back. She stepped into the back of a waiting black sedan. The driver didn't ask for directions. He already knew. As the door closed, a gust of wind swept through the street, carrying with it a different kind of energy, not the noise of protest. The weight of recognition. Inside the precinct, Captain Rawlins was reading through an email marked urgent. The subject line was a single word. Identified. It came from Washington. Every interaction, from the moment Leona entered the grocery store, had now been logged and reviewed. Footage was already being compiled. Statements were being drafted, and names were being listed. He leaned back in his chair, the full weight of what had just occurred beginning to settle on his chest. She hadn't yelled. She hadn't flashed a badge. She hadn't pulled rank. She had allowed the system to do exactly what it was conditioned to do. And now, that system was exposed. At the grocery store, the shift manager was re-watching the security footage for the third time. His hands trembled slightly as he paused on the frame where Mr. Fletcher confronted her. In the background, Leona's calm face looked directly at the camera, almost as if she had known it would be needed later. At City Hall, an assistant handed a folder to the mayor. The mayor scanned the first page. Her expression darkened. She looked up, suddenly aware that this was no longer a local matter. "What's her name again?" she asked quietly. "Congresswoman Leona Hayes," the assistant replied. The room fell silent, because now they remembered. She had spoken on the House floor. She had championed bills on justice reform. She had stood beside presidents. And yet, she had been mistaken for someone who didn't belong, simply because she chose to walk in quietly. The silence that followed wasn't guilt. It was fear. Not fear of exposure, fear of accountability. The realization came too late for all of them. They had looked at her and seen no title, no badge, no threat, but they never looked close enough. And now, every excuse sounded like an echo in a hallway she had already walked out of. Leona didn't need to explain who she was. She had let their assumptions speak first. Now, it was her turn to let the truth follow. It started with emails. At first, they were quiet, sent internally, marked confidential. By the end of the day, there were over 30 requests for footage, policy documents, officer logs, and incident reports. Not just from the precinct where Leona was taken. From oversight committees, from Washington, from the Department of Justice. Captain Rawlins opened his inbox that evening and found a message waiting with a digital seal he had only seen twice before in his career. Its subject, Internal Conduct Review, Priority Level 1. He didn't have to open it to know what it meant. Every officer on duty that day would be pulled for statement. Every radio call would be transcribed. Every camera, every policy memo, every moment of silence recorded in time-stamped stillness. All of it was now evidence. The precinct's mood changed fast. Jokes stopped. Posture shifted. The usual chatter faded into glances and tension. Officer Trent Mallory, who had fastened the cuffs on Leona, was brought into a meeting room with two unfamiliar agents. They didn't accuse him of anything. They just asked him to recount the interaction. Then they asked why he never asked for her name, why no one ran a background check, why her silence made him suspicious. He gave answers, but even he could hear them cracking as they left his mouth. In the grocery store, Mr. Fletcher, the security guard who had followed Leona from aisle to aisle, was placed on leave, pending further review. The footage showed no theft. No loitering, no reason for intervention. Yet he had radioed for police and said, "Something's off about her." Now that sentence was being dissected by a team of attorneys who knew exactly how coded language worked. City Hall wasn't spared either. The mayor's office received a formal notice from the Office of Government Ethics requesting full cooperation in reviewing municipal protocols regarding discrimination response and accountability. The mayor's spokesperson attempted to deflect, but the questions weren't going away. By day 3, the State Attorney General's office launched an independent inquiry into how many similar incidents had gone unreported, how many black women had been escorted, searched, questioned. How many didn't have a brother like Malcolm Hayes? At first, everyone involved tried to distance themselves from it. They used words like misunderstanding and breakdown in procedure, but the review process didn't care about comfort. It cared about pattern, and Leona had become the mirror, one that showed not just what they did, but how easily they had done it. She had not yelled, she had not resisted, she had not needed to. Because now, the system was reviewing itself, and the silence she left behind was louder than any protest they were prepared for. By the end of the week, the first suspension orders were issued. They didn't come with sirens or headlines. They arrived by email. Quiet. Direct, with subject lines that began with administrative action, immediate. Officer Trent Mallory was placed on leave, pending investigation. The form he filled out had been reviewed by 2 federal compliance officers. The wording he used, vague, assumptive, and riddled with passive justifications, became a case study in procedural failure. He was told to turn in his badge, not permanently. Not yet, but it was the first time in his career that no one shook his hand when he left the room. At the grocery store, Mr. Fletcher didn't return to work the following Monday. His security badge was revoked. His actions had triggered a chain of decisions, and now the legal team for the parent corporation was involved. They were reviewing every instance of profiling claims filed over the last 5 years. Mr. Fletcher's name appeared in more than a few. At City Hall, Mayor Ellen Whitford held a press conference that was supposed to be about small business development, but every reporter in the room asked only one thing. What is your response to the Leona Hayes incident? She tried to frame it as local confusion. She called it an unfortunate lapse in judgment. But when a staffer leaned over and whispered in her ear that the House Judiciary Committee had formally requested a hearing with her office, the look in her eyes changed. What had started as a mistake was now becoming a pattern. And patterns could no longer be ignored. Inside the precinct, Captain Rawlins sat with 2 internal affairs agents who asked about hiring practices, de-escalation training, and complaint history. The questions weren't aggressive. They were patient, surgical, designed not to punish, but to understand how something like this had been allowed to feel normal. He had no good answers. The department's public relations officer resigned 2 days later. So did the deputy chief. Each person who had once thought this was just another call, just another woman who didn't cooperate, now found themselves staring at a version of events they could no longer explain. And all of it, every meeting, every investigation, every suspension, began with a woman who had refused to raise her voice. Leona Hayes had not asked for justice with rage. She had not demanded apologies on live television. She had simply let the truth follow its own path. And now it was walking straight through the door of every person who thought she would just disappear. The news cycle moved fast, but her name didn't fade. By Monday, cable anchors were using phrases like systemic failure and quiet power. Opinion pieces appeared in national newspapers. Some praised her restraint, others demanded a statement. But Leona Hayes gave none. She didn't appear on television. She didn't post on social media. She didn't call for protests. She returned to work. That alone made headlines. She walked back into the Capitol building with the same steady posture she had always carried. No extra guards, no entourage. Just a leather folder in one hand and silence at her side. Reporters waited outside committee hearings. They called her office. They emailed her chief of staff. But every inquiry was met with the same answer. The Congresswoman has no comment at this time. Inside communities across the country, her silence said more than any soundbite could. Black mothers talked about her at dinner tables, telling their daughters how strength doesn't always mean fighting back. Retired teachers brought up her name in book clubs, comparing her to women who had changed history by simply refusing to move. People saw themselves in her. People saw who they wanted to be in her, and the institutions that once dismissed her presence now studied it. Universities invited her to speak. Think tanks published essays about her approach to accountability, but she declined nearly every invitation because she hadn't set out to teach a lesson. She had simply expected to be treated like a person, and when she wasn't, she let the country see what that looked like, not in theory, but in practice. In airports, TSA agents started greeting black women with more care. In classrooms, teachers played back recordings of her house floor speeches long before anyone had thought to profile her at a grocery store. And in city halls, new policies were being drafted that required more than just de-escalation training. They required people to see what they had chosen not to see before. All without her ever speaking into a microphone. Because Leona Hayes understood something very few people in power do. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You just need to live in a way that makes others stop and listen. What started in a single store on a quiet morning had now reached across the country. In cities far from West Haven, municipal police departments began pulling body cam footage from past months. Not because anyone told them to, but because they had seen what happened when no one asked the right questions. Internal review boards that once met quarterly were now convening weekly. One department in Illinois quietly issued a new protocol. Officers were now required to ask a suspect's name before initiating any restraint. Another city in Georgia rewrote its de-escalation guidelines to include a section called Presence Without Threat, a term borrowed from an article that had analyzed Leona's arrest frame by frame. In state after state, training programs were updated. But it wasn't just law enforcement. Private corporations followed suit. One national grocery chain sent out an internal memo urging all locations to conduct a full review of employee interactions with minority shoppers. Not because they had been sued, but because they knew the eyes of the public were watching more closely now. Insurance companies began updating language in their liability clauses. City councils hosted community listening sessions. One university launched a new course on social perception, using Leona's case as the central case study. They titled it, "The Power of Being Seen Too Late." Even in Washington, legislation that had once sat stagnant in subcommittees began moving again, not because Leona pushed for it, but because her presence in every quiet hallway had become a reminder of how easily the system could fail someone who didn't demand to be noticed, and how powerful it could be when that someone simply let the failure finish writing itself. In homes, people who had never paid much attention to politics began reading about her voting record. They saw the woman they had once passed by on a news ticker and now read her floor speeches like testimonies. In Sunday morning services, her story became a sermon. Not about revenge, about dignity, about what it means to respond to injustice without replicating its noise. The waves kept moving, and Leona didn't chase them. She kept working. Quietly, unshaken, because she hadn't intended to start a movement. She had just wanted to buy fruit. They had all returned to their jobs, some with warnings in their files, others with new assignments, lower desks, fewer responsibilities. But none of them returned to their old comfort. Not one. Officer Trent Mallory now worked desk duty. He didn't wear a uniform anymore. His new role involved paperwork, phone calls, and watching people walk by a window he no longer stood behind. Each time someone mentioned the incident, he felt the heat rise in his neck, though no one ever said her name out loud. Mr. Fletcher, the former security guard, never went back to security. The company let him go quietly. No press release, no formal statement, but the decision followed him. A few neighborhood blogs picked up the story. One of them showed a still image of him standing near the produce section, watching her from a distance. He deleted his social media accounts 2 days later. Mayor Ellen Whitford lost more than just political favor. She lost the trust of a city that once believed her strength was grounded in fairness. Every time she spoke in public, someone asked about Leona. She tried to move past it. She tried to redefine it. But the stain didn't fade. Because it wasn't about policy, it was about perception. And now, the perception had changed. At a town hall meeting 3 weeks later, a retired schoolteacher stood up during public comment. Her voice was steady. Her hands were folded politely. But her words left no room for comfort. "You saw a woman and assumed she was invisible," she said. "Now the whole country sees her more clearly than it sees you." No one responded. Because how do you answer the kind of truth that doesn't raise its voice? Even in Washington, colleagues who had once walked past Leona in marble hallways without acknowledgement now stopped to greet her. Some offered kind smiles. Others offered invitations to speak. Most didn't know what to say. They simply nodded quietly, as if to say, "We should have known." But Leona didn't need their apology. She didn't need their admiration. She had never asked to be seen. Only not to be erased. And in the end, that had made all the difference. The people who once dismissed her had now become reflections of their own assumptions. Every headline, every conversation, every ripple of change reminded them of the moment they had failed to look closer. And Leona? She remained steady, because being remembered was never her goal. Being respected was enough. The letters started arriving one by one, handwritten notes. Formal statements, emails sent through layers of communication staff and advisors. They came from people in uniform. People in suits. People who once looked through her like she was air. Some were short. I deeply regret the misunderstanding. Others were long. Upon further reflection, I realized the assumptions we carried led to a regrettable incident that does not reflect our values. Leona read some, she discarded most, because she knew the difference between accountability and performance. She had lived through the silence. She had felt the cold metal on her wrists. She had watched the room fall quiet when her name was finally spoken aloud. What she needed wasn't regret. It was recognition. And that had already come, not through apologies, but through change. Mr. Fletcher sent a letter. It arrived without a return address. Inside, the handwriting was uneven, almost hesitant. I didn't know who you were, but that's not the problem. The problem is that I thought I did. She didn't write back, not because she was angry, but because she didn't want to become his moment of closure. That wasn't her responsibility. Officer Trent Mallory emailed a formal statement to her office. It was reviewed by her staff and forwarded to a folder she never opened. It ended with a line that read, "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me." But forgiveness wasn't the point. The point was that he had never thought he needed it. Not until the world had reminded him. At City Hall, the mayor stood behind a podium and offered an apology to Leona and to the community. Cameras flashed, reporters scribbled notes. She called it a moment of deep reflection and institutional reckoning. Leona wasn't there. She had been invited. But she declined. Because she knew what the apology was for, it wasn't for her. It was for the people who needed to feel like they had said something. Meanwhile, Leona was back at work. She sat in budget meetings, reviewed bills, met with constituents. Her calendar was full of names who had always seen her clearly. Women from church groups, local educators, healthcare workers. People who had known her not from the news, but from her work. They never apologized, because they never had to. They had never been the ones who looked away. In one quiet moment between meetings, her chief of staff handed her another envelope. "No return address," she said. Leona held it for a second, then placed it unopened in a drawer. Not everything needs to be read. Not every apology needs to be received. Some things are better left resting where they came from, in the minds of those who finally saw what they had chosen not to before. And Leona. She had already moved on, because she never waited for the words. She had let the truth speak first. And that voice had never needed permission. The sky was clear that morning. The city moved as it always did. Traffic lights blinked. Coffee brewed behind glass counters. Newspapers stacked neatly on sidewalk bins. But something in the air had shifted. Not loud, not obvious. Just different. At the edge of downtown, in front of a modest brick building with bronze letters that read 5th District Office of Representative Leona Hayes, the flag rose slowly in the breeze. Inside, Leona sat quietly at her desk, reviewing the final draft of a proposal. Nothing about her expression had changed. Nothing about her routine seemed new, but everything around her had moved. The precinct that once processed her had implemented 3 new training modules. The grocery chain that had called the police released a national apology and began working with advocacy groups on racial bias education. A dozen local officials had either resigned or been reassigned. And none of that came from a speech. It came from her stillness, from her decision not to shout, but to let the facts echo. She stood, gathered her folder, and stepped out into the hallway. Staff greeted her with quiet nods, not because they feared her, but because they respected her. Because they understood what she had carried without ever making them feel it. On the sidewalk, she passed a group of high school students on a civics field trip. One of them recognized her. The girl nudged her friend and whispered, "That's her." Leona smiled gently, not in pride, in grace. She kept walking, because her work wasn't done. Not in that district. Not in that country. But now, every place she stepped into paused a little longer before making assumptions. Every room she entered took a moment to listen before it judged. And every person who once believed she was invisible had learned something they could no longer forget. Not from a headline, not from a scandal, but from a woman who walked quietly into a store, asked for nothing, and left behind a legacy of consequence. Leona Hayes didn't change the world with anger. She changed it with presence. And as she turned the corner, disappearing into the rhythm of a city that had once looked right past her, one thing became clear. She was never just passing through. She was leading the way. In a world where people often equate power with volume, Leona Hayes reminds us that quiet strength carries farther than any shouted demand. She didn't fight for attention. She didn't explain herself. She simply let others reveal who they were and let the truth walk in behind her. Her story is a lesson in presence, a reminder that dignity doesn't need to raise its voice. Sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is stand still, hold our ground, and let the system see itself, unfiltered and unprotected by excuses. For those of us who have lived long enough to know that real change takes time, Leona's journey feels familiar. It teaches us that silence, when chosen wisely, isn't weakness. It's strategy, and that respect, once earned through integrity and restraint, leaves a deeper mark than any headline. We may not all hold public office, but we all hold influence, and sometimes the most lasting impact we make begins not with what we say, but with what we choose not to say and how we carry ourselves through it all.